story of connections, what holds us together, are emotions. You know, the feeling of fellowship and warmth, or the classic phrase, the love between our brothers and our sisters, the feeling of commonality and common purpose and trust that allows us as groups to work together to make some positive changes happen. And then that deep love that allows us to continue the most important paths we're going to take. But there's also negative emotions, and these negative emotions basically can be like acid to our social connections. Feelings of anger, hurt, disdain, resentment. These are kind of the feelings that really push us apart, or that keep us apart. So the question is, what should we do with those negative feelings? And the tendency is to push them aside. We know that we're having some conflict with someone who's in our life that we care about, and they've irritated us. We want to push those feelings aside. We want to bury them. And there's certain sort of virtues to suppressing. We know there's religious edicts that you should consider evil thoughts as sins and banish them. There's social pressures. We don't want other people, the people we care about, to see us being negative or to see us being critical. And we don't want to see ourselves that way. We don't want to see ourselves as having bad thoughts, bad feelings with people we care about. So there's a lot to recommend suppression. The only problem with suppression is that it doesn't work. For a couple seconds here, I want you to think about whatever you want, but do not think about me wearing a Batman suit. Do not do that. And if you do that, try to banish it from your thought. And of course, the more you try to do that, the more me wearing my cape is going to become more and more evident, right? And that's the same thing for all emotions. The more we try to suppress them, the more potent they become. And so it's called actually the boomerang effect. So if suppression doesn't work, what do? Well, we disclose. It turns out, this is Freud's great insight, that he found that his most disturbed patients, those who had deep trouble, were greatly relieved and almost instantly relieved by putting their thoughts and feelings into language. It was called the talking cure. 100 years later, James Pennebaker basically did experiments confirming the power of disclosure, where in his studies he had people just simply write out thoughts and feelings about some past, current, or traumatic events, something that they've kept secret, something they haven't told other people that still troubled them. And he found that through disclosure, it relieved physical stress, it boosts people's immune system. So they've taken blood tests showing that after disclosure, people's T cell counts are higher, and it reduces physical illness. So we now sort of have what might be kind of a paradoxical understanding of how to secure our positive relationships. That if negative emotions disrupt connections, and if disclosure resolves negative emotions, will disclosure be a way in which we can strengthen our bonds with people? And so I've looked at this in two particular areas. One is, will disclosure, our negative or hostile feelings, improve forgiveness, and will also make us less likely to blame victims. So let me start with the first set of studies. In this case, we're looking at the issue of disclosure and forgiveness. And we had people think about a betrayal. And it turns out when you ask people to list what are the worst things that could happen to you, betrayal is always one of the very top ones. But as much as betrayal is a negative event, if you can forgive, there's tremendous sort of value to forgiveness. It leads to less depression, less anxiety, improved self-image. But we can't simply throw a switch and forgive. We can't, as much as we like to say, okay, all is forgiven. It doesn't work that way. Forgiveness is fundamentally an emotional act, and we have to somehow address the emotions that prevent forgiveness from happening. So how do we do that? Well, anticipating Freud, anticipating Pennebaker, was Benjamin Franklin, who, when he was our first ambassador to France, and he would get all kinds of horrible insults about the United States, about himself, about who knows what, he would write these furious letters that only he could write, tremendously eloquent poison pen letters to his enemies. And then he'd stick them in a drawer and never mail them. Simply writing, he found, made him feel better. Well, we basically borrowed Pennebaker's and also Franklin's insight in this first study. So we had people think about either an acquaintance, someone who they neither like nor dislike, nor a betrayer, someone who they used to feel particularly close to, a really good friend or family member, who betrayed them in a bad way at a bad time. And after they thought very deeply about either an acquaintance or a betrayer, they then wrote, just to themselves, for about 15 minutes. Some of them wrote only factually. They could write what was the person they're thinking about? What were they wearing? How was their height? Was their weight? But they couldn't get out any of their thoughts and feelings about that person. Others, what we call the disclosed condition, they wrote out their thoughts and feelings freely. So we had 4 groups: acquaintance, disclosed; acquaintance, suppressed; betrayer, disclosed; betrayer, suppressed. They then answered one question: how close, I think you read this thing. How close do you feel towards the person you wrote about? And what we found was that for an acquaintance, disclosing or suppressing, it makes no difference. You don't feel close to the person to begin with. Writing about them makes no difference. For someone who betrayed you, if you suppressed, you feel almost no closeness. They betrayed you. You had no chance to address your emotions. But if you could disclose, you now feel closer. Not hugely, but this is significant, and the process of forgiveness is now beginning. We looked at what people wrote, and the more they wrote, the more they forgave in this disclosed condition. Moreover, the more anger they disclosed, the closer they felt. So now it takes us to my next level, studies having to do with victim blaming. And it's a peculiarity that we tend to blame those most needing of our sympathy. We blame the poor, we blame people who suffer natural disasters, we blame victims of terrorism or foreclosures. We even blame people who are terminally ill for their illness. Why would we do this? Well, we need to see the world, whether we believe it or not, as a fair, just, manageable place, where good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. When we see someone being victimized, that threatens this belief in a just world. It creates very disturbing emotions in us. How can a good person suffer a bad event? But if we can say, maybe that person wasn't quite so good, or so smart, or so brave, after all, then we can say, well, a bad thing happened, but a bad thing happened to someone who, in a sense, let this happen to them. So we now, by blaming the victim, we've restored our belief in a just world, and our distress abates. But if this is really a problem about emotions, then we have an alternative route. We can disclose our emotions, which should then reduce those negative emotions. We no longer need to blame the victim. The problem of disturbing emotions is taken care of. So this is how we tested that. We had people watch one of 2 movies. One was called The Accused. Jodie Foster plays this as based on a true story of a young woman goes to a bar and she is serially raped at the bar while the other patrons just watch. The subjects in the other condition watch a documentary of Margaret Thatcher, who also has many male opponents, but Margaret's no victim. After they watch the movie, they either disclose their thoughts and feelings in writing, just to themselves, or they can only write factually. We then had them leave, and they came back a week later, and the subjects came back. We again 4 groups: victim, disclose; victim, suppress; non-victim, disclose; non-victim, suppress. And then when they came back, they were asked questions about the woman. Did she show poor judgment? Was she ineffective? Was she responsible? Was she immoral? All these bundled up to one measure of blaming. There is no difference for disclosing or not disclosing for the non-victim. But for the victim, they blamed her if they could not express their emotions. If they could express their emotions, they did not blame. And the more distress they disclosed, the less they blamed. We're a little concerned. Maybe disclosure is like an analgesic. It just makes you feel better about everything and everybody. So in the second study, we looked at whether or not disclosure affected how people felt about the attackers of the victim and the victim herself. Disclosing, not disclosing, it doesn't change the propensity to blame the attackers, only the victim. And what's important here is that the victim is nearly blamed by those who suppress as much as they blame her attackers. So what are our conclusions here? Suppressing bad feelings can erode social bonds. So in a sense, we should suppress the urge to suppress. Suppressing deters forgiveness and increases victim blaming. But by disclosing, by opening up some of these forbidden thoughts and feelings, we're more likely to reduce those harmful effects. So in a certain way, our founding fathers had sort of some clever insights that freedom of speech is associated with not necessarily happiness, but a reduction of the power of negative emotions. And together this can lead to more perfect unions. I want to thank my collaborators. So thank you.